very happy you were able to come tonight. And my name is Susan Bransfield. I'm the first selectman for the town of Portland. And this is an exciting night. As one person asked me, is this going to be an exciting night? I think so. And I think it's exciting because there's going to be a lot of information, and it's in its final format from the very generous grant that the town of Portland received from the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. It's a $50,000 grant that was given to us. The ultimate funding comes from you. The funding from the Department of Economic and Community Development funds the preservation for historic preservation. And in turn, we, the municipalities, compete for the dollars in order to look at particular space, particular areas of historic significance, and also make sure that as development alternatives are presented, and I believe we're having at least 2, if not more, alternatives for what used to be the Elmcrest site. The owner of the site is here tonight, Fred Hassan, and we expect that the developer, Dan Bertram, will be joining us. I know that he's in traffic right now, unfortunately. And so we'll have the final presentation tonight, and the alternatives will be presented as to how what used to be the Elmcrest site can be developed with an eye toward what is marketable and what is good for economic development and what is good for our community. So we're very grateful for the grant, and we're certainly very pleased, and I think the stakeholders who have been coming to meetings, if you just raise your hand, there's a number of folks in the audience, they have name tags on, that have been coming to stakeholder group meetings to give some guidance to the Steve Cecil group. And they are out of the Boston area. They competed with other firms to get the grant, and they were found to be the best, and I think that's true. They've done a very good job with our stakeholder group with giving presentations, at least 2 public presentations, one to gather information, one to give you a semblance of what direction they were going in, and now tonight is the 3rd general or plenary session at which you'll learn the final report. There is a PDF of the presentation and of the report that will be made available to the town, and we will put it on our website. Our town planner is here as well, Deanna Rhodes, and other members of our Board of Selectmen are here, Kathy Richards and Howard Rosenblum, and we may be joined by some others. Many of you participate in various capacities in our town. I can't begin to thank you all, and I know that you're on various boards and commissions, and we're grateful to have you here tonight as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Cecil. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for coming out on a splendid evening in July. We will look forward to an evening here where we talk about the conclusions and recommendations that have come out of the report that we prepared. And I've got a slide presentation to show you, and we'll go through that description with the idea that at the end of that, if you have questions, comments, or thoughts, we're all ears, and we'll just kick off a general conversation about what we've learned along the way. And even after that, there's still some cookies and lemonade out in the lobby, and we'll stay here and answer questions that might be appropriate. So with that, if we can go ahead and probably drop the house lights, and I'll begin the process of the slideshow here. Is our stage crew still around?
Yes. Stage crew is David.
There we go.
We are being recorded tonight.
Okay. There we go. No, the other way, keep going. Need to come down. There we go. A little bit more. Still got a spotlight on the screen here. We drop talking at some more. We've got a spotlight on the screen right now. Other direction. Light. A little bit more. Well, we can do with that. Good enough. It's close enough, right? All right. So here we are, and this is a report that has been prepared with a lot of different participants in that in the process. It was a grant and part of a really fantastic program administered by the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, and Brad Scheid, the project director, who's taken a seat. And the circumstances that we have found ourselves in, you have found yourselves in, is one of a remarkably interesting historic site that had been originally a series of spectacular homes converted into a specialized institution for mental health and eventually other kinds of circumstances, proposed for redevelopment and stalled by the Great Recession that we've just had. And the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation has put together a really remarkable program recognizing that the success of historic preservation in individual buildings is a function of having a successful economic future for the properties in the districts in which they're located, and that it takes a combination of new development, redevelopment, renovation, and historic preservation to put communities back together again, particularly in a Connecticut environment where you have such a rich heritage of places. But the idea has been to try to find a way, if it's practical, to balance all of these considerations. The team that we put together, the professional team, has been led by the Cecil Group. And we're planners and architects and landscape architects who have a significant background in both the public and private side in repurposing historic sites and buildings. The team has included Bertram and Cochran, who are real estate development and market specialists, and Ty and Bond, because there are some important questions that needed to be answered having to do with the environmental history of the site and the potential that there might be some materials that need to be removed and some costs. So the meeting agenda tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the purpose. We're going to talk about the results of the last public meeting. How many of you were at the last public meeting? So most of you. So we'll tell you what we learned through that process. Then we're going to talk about what we believe is the preferred approach, at least in terms of the recommendations that we're bringing forward in this report, and then related findings and recommendations. So part of this, of course, is to make sure that we're continuing this shared dialogue between the community, and a shared dialogue that has been a very positive part of this process with the owners and the developers, because we have to remember that in this whole process, the future is going to be determined through a series of efforts that are going to culminate in with the property owners and developers, and of course the community, through what we call the entitlements, the permits and approvals that are necessary for project to go ahead, will find. So our purpose is really to try to understand how these various dimensions of the community will come together. You have the owner and the developer, the town and the community that it represents, and then there's the marketplace out there, because in the end, even we all can have great dreams about what will occur, but unless somebody comes and buys and rents and leases and sells things on that site, it won't work either. So our job has been to understand what the community visions might be and think about a development approach by taking a look into the market circumstances and advance some general ideas about the site. I want to make sure that we understand in doing this that this is a process of exploration and discussion. We are not proposing specific solutions, in the sense that we're really not as I've just described, bringing a proposal or project forward, but we are hopefully showing how the site might feasibly be organized and advanced in the future. So one of the things that we did along the way was to take a look at 3 different ways in which the site might be redeveloped within the context of a market study that had been done previously, the kinds of uses that might make sense. And these are just quick diagrams to show you or re-show you what some of the choices and options that we were exploring at that time. Now, even then we were saying, this isn't a site plan. It's not like you look at these and say, well, I want that. What was that old show where you picked what was behind door number 1 or door number 2 or door number 3? It's not quite like that. We discussed these things to learn from them. There was some important input that we had into the formation of these options, with the understanding that in today's circumstances, there are certain aspects of the retail market that may be very strong here. The idea of a pharmacy, possibly a small grocery store, other kinds of uses make sense. A limited amount of demand under the right circumstances for office or commercial uses, professional office, for example, medical offices might make sense, but it all depends on whether the tenants for those kinds of buildings would step forward and find this site more attractive than others. But the residential, a rather significant amount of residential looks very promising for the site overall, up to about approximately 200 units if it's done properly. And these would be market rate units. And all of these uses benefit from being at a hinge location right next to that bridge, right next to your historic Main Street district, and right across the river from Middletown. So you have great regional access. It's a picturesque site, and those characteristics add up into some choices in terms of how the site could work. Now, our starting point in all this was also to make sure to understand how the historic resources might be preserved, but would need to be preserved in the context of feasible development on the site, and preserved in the sense of being a useful contributor to the overall success of the location in the future. As we take a look at this, here are a list of some of the comments that came forward in the public discussion after we had walked through these. So, for example, retaining historic buildings was something that many people agreed with. A reasonable mix of uses, and I think the reasonableness there was that it shouldn't be necessarily dominated entirely by one use or more. Incorporating green space and open space into the overall site composition is important. There's certainly tax advantages, and the notion that a pharmacy or other kind of business attraction would be an important idea. I should mention that there were other people who said that would a second pharmacy right across from another pharmacy work. Well, if you drive around any region of the country, you'll see that these places tend to cluster next to each other or very close to each other, so that it's actually a fairly common pattern. The potential for river views, this once was a river view site, but however it's done, the idea of retaining some characteristics of a small town character and things that would be appropriate for Portland. In terms of the things that people didn't find attractive about these ideas, was the lack of recreation space and that whole idea, well, do we really need another pharmacy? Again, what we said is we think the market may very well like it, but the notion of a lot of surface parking as you develop this, creating impervious surface, trying to decrease the negative appearance of lots of asphalt is an important idea. There were options that looked at having an entrance in the middle of the site, Perry Street, and how it might be thought of as a buffer or an edge were considered as a negative aspect of how some of those planning concepts were put forward. We had shown one of the options would be to actually have an entrance off of Main Street, and that might cause traffic issues. There was a preference for more commercial, as long as it wasn't really big box retail. There was some negative reactions to the idea of big box, meaning the really large format retailers. So then we took an informal straw poll, and what people seem to be indicating about these different alternatives is that the alternatives B and C, which retain some amount of the historic buildings with inserted other buildings around them, might make sense. This was a scheme in which a fairly intact town green concept was left in place. In fact, with some additional smaller scale buildings suggested as a possibility, and looking at a residential complex of apartment buildings and maybe a grocery store, pharmacy, smaller commercial buildings tucked down in the back. And one of the things that I should emphasize is that this site, as you well know, is sloped. So the areas that are up near the street are actually quite a bit above grade relative to the back part of the site, which is both a development opportunity and a constraint. This was more of a village type scheme where they would have lots of smaller pieces. The challenge with that, of course, is trying to come up with an approach where the uses and the configuration makes sense for smaller pieces. Coming out of this, one of the things that we want to emphasize is that we don't actually have a winning scheme as a site plan. The winning scheme, or the winning approach, is something that will grow out of the specific proposals that the developers bring forward, the discussions, negotiations, and the approvals that you'll shape in the future. But we've tried to open the window to a series of possibilities, but there's some general principles that we would like to discuss in terms of the way that the future might work out. So we're going to talk about the potential redevelopment program, which is the stuff, the clay that you can build the redevelopment out of, how you might approach the site, what we've learned, some key considerations about getting to and from it, how this relates to the preservation approach, and just thinking about that whole idea of this being part of the town and how it can work together. So in terms of a potential redevelopment program, we really think that a reflection coming out of the market studies, which are reflected in this chart, are helpful to understand, because we can wish for things, but if the market's not going to support it, they won't happen. And just to touch base on this a little bit, what we found is that, particularly in the context of housing, that there really is quite a demand for housing under the right circumstances, including possibly some of the reuse of the houses. They're expensive to do it, but possibly. Office, because it's relatively small scale, matching the scale of the kind of small businesses, either reusing the buildings or some modest new development. Industrial wasn't highly, this doesn't seem to be appropriate for this, or even flexible industrial. One of the things that we did emphasize is that the study showed, and Maura Cochran, to her credit, really delved into great detail on the hotel idea. And as desirable as it sounds, the kinds of people who are developing hotels at all scales have other choices that appear to be more desirable than this site. That's not to say that it's not impossible, but there's nothing that we can see that would predict that. And the kinds of things that we look at are exactly the same things that the hotel developers look at. So those characteristics don't appear to be strong. But retail, general retail, pharmacy, and restaurants, some good restaurants, all of those have a really high chance. So out of that, some combination of the retail and the residential seem to resonate with the community and resonate with the marketplaces as a whole. The idea, of course, is to have active uses that can take advantage of the Main Street side and perhaps portions of the Marlborough Street side. The residential uses that tend to lean over towards the Perry Avenue side, and the interior of the site would make more sense. So the potential redevelopment program, if you start to think about it, here's Marlborough Street up at the top, here's Main Street on the left-hand side, the bridge would be down here off the screen. The idea of mixed uses, retail at the corner makes a lot of sense from a retail standpoint. It's visible, and we're going to talk a little bit about how accessible it might be. And lower down the slope and over towards the other residential areas moving away, residential might make sense. From there, the idea of a Main Street corner that has some visibility, but the idea of a green or open space along Marlborough Street in some configuration, and that representing the former front yards, and in some cases actually the backyard of one of the historic buildings, makes a lot of sense. So those were the kinds of ideas. One of the things that we had looked at was the notion that the more the building layout and the characteristics of the buildings can respond to some of the architectural clues that are more village scale and integrate landscaping into the parking lots to avoid that great asphalt uninterrupted look that other places have, would be a useful thing to do. Now, in terms of site circulation and access, one of the things that we had started to explore, which had been talked about in the previous development scenarios, was having a right in and a right turn out on Main Street. And we looked at this from a number of different angles. We talked to the engineers who've been involved with the project and with the town for a while, and we confirmed the best of our ability through a conversation with a representative from CONDOT that they would be react positively to this idea, that they don't, with the scale of a redevelopment. Remember, the redevelopment before had a very significant grocery store and retail component to it. In a more balanced reuse of the site, the total traffic demand is moderated considerably. So in that vein, then, the idea of having a right turn in and a right turn out, which from a retail standpoint is really a compelling, important idea, it seems to make a lot of sense. They're less positive about the idea. I don't think we could rule it out, but it's unlikely that they would allow a left-hand turn to get into the traffic going onto the bridge at that location. It's not impossible, but difficult to imagine. However, reworking that intersection right now of Marlborough and Main Street to tighten it up, to make it more, right now it's sort of a high-speed turn to the right here. It's not a very pedestrian-friendly area. I think they would be open and positive about that from a traffic management standpoint. So the trick is to really think about optimizing an entry location in some location along the Marlborough Street edge, taking advantage of that and really advocating and supporting that entrance. And then the idea with Perry, because there are residential uses a little more sensitive here, maybe this really isn't a prime access or need to be, but for emergency egress. So then from a preservation approach, while there are a number of buildings on the site today, the ones that seem prime opportunities and most valuable for preservation include the Sage, the Hart Jarvis, and the Brainerd House. And the scenarios that we ran from a financial standpoint, and looking at it from a site planning perspective, suggested that, in fact, within the overall economics of a redevelopment, that this is something that could happen. There's some factors that need to be taken into account in reaching that conclusion that I'll talk a little bit about. But as we take a look at this, the idea then of having a prominent Main Street corner with enhanced pedestrian connections along the edges and into the site, some kind of organized village green to accompany that makes a lot of sense. From a financial feasibility standpoint, looking at the market characteristics as we can best understand them, overall, even with the support of the historic preservation and the site planning premiums and the redevelopment premiums, when we talk about premiums, we mean that's extra cost. It's a bit of a lift, but if you look at the feasibility of the project as a whole, it's positive. If you looked at the feasibility of some of those individual buildings, you'd find that they are maybe even be a little bit negative. In other words, if you just look at a building and say, would that be worth saving? Well, it might not be, but if you look at it in the context of an entire site, in the positive attributes of the entire site, bringing in some external subsidies and internal subsidies can make those buildings part of an overall positive pro forma. One of the challenges is that we have to be thoughtful about the fact that as residential development occurs here, with the number of units that are likely to spring up, you can't necessarily rent them, or if they were condominiums, to sell them right away. So there's a bit of a cash flow problem as we take a look at the overall financing of the site until the site is fully leased up and is used. But we did account for the feasibility of the historic buildings within that overall feasibility. In terms of the phasing, there are a lot of factors that go into phasing, and under ideal circumstances, you'd like to have as much as possible all the development as soon as you can, because each of the elements reinforces each other. If there's some nice retail on the site, it helps with the residential uses. The residential uses are not going to be as successful if a portion of the site is not developed, is still empty, or is under construction. However, there are some chances, particularly with the residential that we thought we saw, that you could segment the planning and the development so that you can complete pieces and keep going. We recognize that the site grading and perimeter retaining walls are going to be an important part of this, and the studies that we did suggested, however, that some reasonable terracing not only can happen, but it's going to need to happen under any scenario. And that no matter what happens, the idea of proposing and advancing an access off of Main Street is a critical aspect of this. Now, you have a mixed-use development special regulation in your zoning because the site plan and the development would be substantially revised from the previous version. You would need to go about a process of reviewing the project under those rules. One of the things that would be an absolutely key part of opening the door to this kind of positive redevelopment is changing the proportion of the residential units to the rest of the development. The previous zoning and proposals really had a fairly modest amount of residential in it, and it's our view that in order to make a residential site attractive here, it has to have enough to be really significant, and we don't see an advantage in trying to limit that necessarily in the way that the previous zoning did. So that's an important shift or change. But the scenarios that we presented and talked about are all consistent otherwise with the current zoning. Is this going backwards? Okay. So next steps, and talking a little bit about where we think the next steps are. The sense of partnership and discussion with the owners have their perspectives. They need to bring tenants to the table. They've got financing. They've got to put together the plans. They need to come forward with specific proposals. You now have, through this report, and there's a pretty extensive report that covers all those previous meetings and all the data, et cetera, is a resource for you all to use. But it's going to be through that discussion that you're going to reach agreement. I think that the notion of changing the zoning and adjusting the zoning so that you can allow this to bloom and be successful within the range of uses that seem to have emerged is extremely important. But the project review and approval, we try to give you parameters of what we think could occur from a feasibility standpoint, and that the interest in town for historic preservation, for public space, for the organization, for the design character, you're now equipped with that, and it's been an excellent discussion along the way. We do suggest that the historic preservation support, and this is something that Brad and his role and the others at the Connecticut Trust have a stake in this project, have a lot more understanding of it, and that the historic tax credits, for example, could be an extremely important and helpful tool. And one of the things that the development team should know and the town should know is that you have a group of people who are extremely knowledgeable, who are in a position to work and help find ways to bring some of that funding benefit to making the historic preservation portion of this more feasible. The idea of tax incentives and abatement, we know that that's a very important part of the discussions and the decisions. Again, the decisions need to be made about what will be supported and what are the shared interests that come out of that. But having a site where there are, for example, street and sidewalk infrastructure investments, tax incentives, the chance to proactively bring in historic tax credits are all ingredients to creating that kind of mixed use and combination of preservation and new development that everyone has talked about here. We do think that the improved site access should be something go right, follow up. Let's keep that get CONDOT going, get them started so that that momentum, that opening that we have gets confirmed and advanced. And finally, that notion that through a process like this, a shared community vision will play out over time, and you all have been fantastic in both your comments and in the participation here. So we hope that each one of these steps will move ahead. We've described in the report what really needs to happen with each one of those, and we've set time frames for when we think that can be reasonably accomplished. So there's a to-do list, there's a job jar that we're leaving at the end of this for your review and thought. But the notion of continued work, support, advocacy, leading to those kinds of tax credits and other benefits that come along are extremely important. And again, just knowing that all of you, and particularly the town government administrations, elected officials, are all going to be important players and partners in working with the developers and the owners overall. CONDOT being the exception, where you're going to really need to reach outside of the community to bring that important connection through the state. So there you go. That's where we are in terms of our recommendations. We think this is a doable deal. We know, however, that it's through the conversations that will be ongoing that the final solutions and the build product, and we're very, very optimistic that this is a process that's going to reach not only a shift in gears, but in the not too distant future, you will no longer be looking at a dilapidated property that people can remember the good old days, but the good new days are going to be coming. The economy's right, the players are in place, it's time to get going. Thanks very much. Yeah, that'd be great. Maybe if we can have the house lights back up, that'd be great. So questions or thoughts, observations? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the residential units.
Yeah.
In this new plan, you mentioned about 200 units.
Around 200 units is a pretty good number for what is a substantial amount that kind of creates a sense of place and community, and can be absorbed on the site with buildings that are of frame construction, no towers. This isn't a location that really makes sense for that, even if you wanted to. So these would be buildings like that, yeah.
That was my follow-up. In the previous plan, what was the number of residential units you had mentioned 300 per year?
It was fewer, it was much fewer. Fred, do you remember how many?
81.
80?
81.
81, okay, 81 units in the previous version.
Yeah.
And it was kind of capped also because of the zoning. And we're suggesting that the marketplace should be followed, and it's actually harder to develop sometimes fewer units than to have something that creates more of a sense of place. Yes, sir?
Could you repeat the question? Because
Sure.
you can't hear them.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the question had to do with where the number of units, what's behind the number of units, but also how many units had been proposed in the previous proposal that had gotten approval. And the answer to that question was, I think, 81 units. And the answer to the question about the 200 units has to do with that idea that it's it's a kind of a market point where you get enough, what we call critical mass, enough people, enough of a sense of a place that people are really attracted, and there are benefits to having that. People who will live there, there's certainly tax benefits associated with multifamily housing of this type, and there are big benefits in terms of having patrons for those businesses right there. So that's a scale that makes more sense, we think. Yes, sir.
One of the questions I have is the access to be able to get into that. I understand the right-hand turn, all the Main Street.
Right.
But what about people coming from down Main Street to head to Middletown? How do they get in? That's my biggest question.
Yeah, so the route is right. What would happen is that they would be able to take a left off of Marlborough Street. So the question again, yes, I'm sorry, I forgot right away. How, this is, I have a short-term memory problem, really short-term.
You originally,
Yeah.
in one of the other meetings, you mentioned that it wasn't feasible to come in off of Marlborough Street.
No, it's feasible. There's, one of the things that happened is that we were looking at an intersection that would be really close to Main Street along Marlborough Street and push it down towards that end. And we found that that really didn't work. The queues, they call them queues, the lines of cars coming along Marlborough Street headed for the intersection, it wasn't a good place to put a curb cut. But a little bit further back, say in the neighborhood of where the existing entrance is, just to give an example, that's far enough back from the intersection. So if someone's coming towards Main Street along Marlborough, you just take a left right into the site, no problem.
Right, so I'm gonna take a left on Marlborough.
Yeah, or you can come down Main Street, take a left on Marlborough, and then you'll take a right into the site.
Okay, my point being now, if I'm taking a left on Marlborough, the way it's set up now, you've got all that traffic coming over the bridge, you have to blend in. Now you've got to get over, if you want to go in there, you might not have enough time to get over.
Well, it has to be controlled by a traffic light, for sure. And the traffic light would have to be set up so that when you take a left-hand turn on Main Street, you're not running into people turning right. And it would be a single, you'd take one lane of left-hand traffic, and there would be no conflicting traffic as you take that left. But it's one of the reasons that we think that kind of cleaning up that intersection is an important idea, because what happens now is people coming off the bridge really fly around that corner. It's like a ramp.
So they're going to stop.
You need to slow them down before they take that right-hand turn. It's not a good situation. I suppose if I were flying home in the evening, it'd be a good thing, but to have a kind of a Main Street district with uses and retail and places to live, you really don't want to have that kind of a high-speed ramp right there. You want just what we call calming traffic. Just calm down. It would change people's trip times by a few seconds, but it would make it a lot safer and a lot more convenient. And then that would facilitate the left-hand turn coming down Main Street and turning left onto Marlborough Street.
So basically you're saying you're not going to have that turn.
Yeah, we really, and by the way, ConDOT agrees with us on that. It'll be right, you'll still be able to take a right-hand turn, and it may be a right-hand turn on a stop or, red, but you don't want to be running into, because it's almost like a highway ramp where you've got to merge. And then you don't want to have merge lanes right in the middle of your downtown. No, that's not a good idea. But there's plenty of room, and when you look at the traffic volumes, although I think they probably feel very significant to you in town who live here and work with it all the time from a traffic engineer standpoint, these are not very scary traffic volumes if you manage them properly. There's plenty of room to marshal the vehicles if we rearrange the pavement a little bit better.
Now, same thing coming from, let's say, East Hampton, can you be able to take a left into that?
So a left from Marlborough Street. Yeah, you just come in, you take a left, and the street's wide enough. One of the good things about Marlborough, it's a pretty wide street, so you can have what we call a left-hand turn channel, and people can keep going. They won't have to back up behind you at all.
There's not going to be a light for that.
No, I wouldn't think so. No, I don't think it would be. Traffic engineers call them warrants. So would it be warranted? My own guess is no, you wouldn't need one. The other thing that's kind of nifty about the Main Street connection is it starts to break up the demand in any one intersection. So anybody coming from Middletown across the bridge has already taken a right to get onto the site. They don't have to turn right on Marlborough and then take a turn. It's just much better if you have multiple access points and you can distribute traffic. and that's one of the reasons when you'll all want to be thinking about Perry Avenue and how that works, because if you did provide some access along there, now you've got 3 access points, and it just starts to diminish the number of cars at any one place, and doesn't turn out to be as big a problem.
Is that part of it, what's in the works, or something on Perry Avenue too?
Well, on Perry Avenue, because what we heard from the community, what we're saying is think about this as just an emergency egress, and focus on other areas so that it doesn't have the residential impacts. But I just raised that to say that when you look at it, make sure you look at all 3 of them. As you diminish the number of access points, you're increasing the congestion. And places where you distribute access points turn out to be not nearly as big a problem. That's just a general principle. So another question or comment? Yes, sir. I'll make sure. I'm trying to pick up other people and I'll get back to you. Yes, sir.
Okay, what consideration has been done to try to link this area with the main part of Main Street, which is, of course, from Rite Aid north?
Yeah, I think that part.
Traffic in some way?
So the question is, what thinking has been done to link this area with the other parts of Main Street, beginning with Rite Aid, but going up the street? And one of the things that the town will need to do is take a look at streetscape and landscape and traffic calming, generally speaking, to strengthen the pedestrian links between this location and the other parts of Main Street. Well, our sense is that this is not something which would draw either traffic or trade from the other parts of Main Street, but would actually add to it. If you have more people, more activity, a more pleasant and interesting place, it'll work, but it's really important to get that intersection to be pedestrian friendly, because Main Street districts work best if people don't just drive their car from store to store. It's best if they walk. And so this is in reasonable walking distance, but you've got to make sure that the edges of this site and the crosswalks and the sidewalks leading up into Main Street are really improved over time. Yes, sir. You had it. I'll get back to you.
In our previous comments and study, a pharmacy was not the public's #1 interest.
Mm-hmm.
Yet tonight, we thought I was only the #1 interest, because the pharmacy fit very well in the economic development of this property. We mentioned, you hit on a little bit, Trader Joe's. It's a specialty, I don't know much about, that's a specialty shop,
Mm-hmm.
something different. That's not in this final plan that I can see what.
Oh, it's completely open. I should say, okay, the question is that in terms of the previous public meeting, there was not support for a second pharmacy, but it seems to be a third pharmacy, excuse me, pharmacy across the street from Rite Aid. But, and we acknowledged that in the slideshow, we said there were some people who thought it was good, there were some people who thought that it wasn't good, it wasn't uniform, we heard opinions both ways. But what we said is that the marketplace, and people who were suggesting that there wasn't market room for it, this is a factual question more than anything, is it from a market standpoint, these kinds of pharmacists actually like to locate pretty near each other a lot of times. So the market side of it, and then so the question would be, if the market would support it and it makes sense in this location as part of it, would it displace any other kinds of uses? And the fact is the site's large enough that if you had a use, and we were being much more generic about it because, but if there were a kind of specialty food market, that kind of thing, that the market would support, we didn't suggest that shouldn't happen or wouldn't happen necessarily, but that would be up to the marketplace to decide whether it can be supported or not. To find that location, we did not find adequate support for a large supermarket. We didn't think that was going to be feasible. So the idea was the door would be open to these uses and that they would be market supportable. Yeah.
What I've seen in the past, if I'm going to a CVS or a larger pharmacy, I'm not gonna walk Main Street, down Main Street, no matter what you do with the sidewalks and connections. I'm going to the CVS, I go in, do my thing, hop back in the car and go. That type of business is not gonna entice me to walk down to our historical district or Main Street.
Yeah, that use alone may not be. That what happens is that we have a CVS in my downtown. I live in Dedham. It's an historic downtown. And I know that I walk to it because the parking lot's not big enough for all the places. I go get a cup of coffee. I walk across the street, talk to a friend, and go to CVS, go to the laundry. I go to multiple places. But it's because there are multiple places there. And the unfortunate thing in some ways, and this is a design consideration that you all should consider in looking at the layout and the location of those sorts of things. Some of them these days are designed just as though they had parking on all sides and drive-up windows and all sorts of things, and they're not friendly to walk up to. So in the site planning, making sure that there is a friendly walking path to it so that you can actually get there. But it depends on having enough stuff in order to make it a walking destination. Otherwise, you're right, it just turns into another automobile-oriented thing and doesn't become a main street or anything. Yeah. Yes? Yeah.
Can we go back to that?
Certainly.
I don't know anything about mixed use,
Mhm.
but if you have 200 residential units
Mhm.
and you have commercial retail
Mhm.
units, you have the same traffic pattern for the residences as well as delivery trucks, garbage trucks, commercial vehicles. It looks like you're using the same driveway for all of this traffic. And I was wondering if you had considered the westbound side of the property for commercial traffic.
For the lower side, you mean the lower side? Yeah, we did sort of take a look at it. In terms of the patterns for residential, people leave in the morning and they come back in the evening. So they're leaving 8 to 9 o'clock and they're coming back, 5 to 7 o'clock. That's sort of the pattern. And usually deliveries are happening during the day, so we rarely see a significant conflict. And I guess I don't know how to express this other than to say, again, I didn't repeat the question, did I? The question really has to do with the traffic patterns and how residential and commercial uses overlap or and how access could work. I think the response again is that given the patterns that usually occur, they don't actually overlap very much. They happen at different times. But this site, given the scale and the amount of uses that we're looking at, is pretty small scale relative to the amount of traffic that's going to be generated. It will disperse over a period of time and should be able to be fitted in without a lot of trouble. You'll obviously want to have the loading docks located in places that are sort of out of the way. And if there is a possibility of an access from the lower roads, that's something that could be looked at, but we just didn't see it enough of a problem. When you get to really large concentrations of retail and housing, I'm talking 500,000 square feet, we get really big, then you start to have issues. But this is pretty town scaled, so we're not too worried about it. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, if someone lived there and they need to go to Milltown to work or go across the bridge, how are they going to get out of there and get to work?
Well, they would go out Marlborough Street. They'd go out out onto Marlborough Street, take a left-hand turn, get down to the light, take a left-hand turn, and I like that commute myself. Well, I understand that it seems like a very long way and congested, but if I lived on the site, maybe I have to wait worst case, that might have to wait a signal cycle or so, which is usually 90 seconds, is what typical signal cycles are. So for the commute to Middletown will be a matter of 5 to 10 minutes. It's really good, and that's one of the benefits of it. So you really have two intersections, one at Marlborough Street and one at Main Street, and then you're at Middletown. So it's about as close as you can get without being in Middletown, frankly. That's the advantage of it. And the numbers, again, if you look at the density of uses, and I'm sure it feels very congested today, But all things are relative as far as that goes. The amount of demand that's going to be generated out of this development and its ability to fit into the traffic flow is pretty easy from a traffic engineering standpoint. Yes, ma'am.
Has there been any thought, in following up with that lady's question about the western access? How about having them go out the west and under the bridge and up and around?
Well, the question is, how about having people come out underneath on the lower roadway under the bridge and come around? Again, from a traffic standpoint, we don't view this scale of development and the traffic as actually a significant problem to begin with. And to provide a circumstance, again, I think from a perception standpoint, it may seem as a congested area, but this is a very small increment of increase that can be managed through intersection improvements, and to have a development where people can't take the straightest distance between 2 points becomes a problem for it. We're just not seeing this as, in the scale of things, as a very difficult problem to solve. Again, I understand that from a perspective of someone who drives it and has to wait for a light cycle, it can seem very much like a long time, but in the scale of traffic engineering for similar sites, it's pretty doable. Yeah.
First question again. If you're coming out, say you do work in Middletown, you want to come out of there, you really got to cross 4 lanes of highway.
You're going to
left turn.
You're going to have to take a left-hand turn, and the traffic signal timing, one of the things that they'll probably take a look at is pausing the traffic signal enough on the, see, the traffic patterns here are very different in the evenings and the mornings, as you well know. So the number of people who are traveling in different directions, people are trying to flow into Middletown and northbound on the street during the mornings, and it's a reverse flow in the evening. So you may have to look at the timing on the signal lights to make those turns. So to make sure that there's adequate gaps, but we're not seeing these. We work in really significant urban areas all over New England, and the amount of traffic that you have, the room that you have, the width of the road to manage the number of lanes that you have, all seem pretty manageable. Yes, sir.
Has any consideration been done to the traffic circle in this area at Marlboro and Maine? Or I understand possibly it would eliminate the possibility of the traffic light, but definitely in that area.
Right. Well, what happens? We did talk about that, and we're knowledgeable of traffic's rotaries and the kinds of roundabouts that are being put in, or in some cases being taken out of areas. The word on that in this kind of environment is they're really good for cars, they're really bad for pedestrians. We work with one of the largest advocacy group in the country on pedestrian use, and we're in agreement with them that if you're in a Main Street district, you really do not want to have a traffic circle, because the traffic circle facilitates free movement of cars in every direction without having to stop or slow down. And if you look at the way the traffic moves, you have to really watch where the other vehicles are, or you can have a big problem. And if you stop and think about it, because of the circulation, you look to the left in order to see where the moving traffic. The guy who's going to hit you is coming from the left. The pedestrian that's crossing on the right, you don't have time to see, and they're extremely dangerous for pedestrians. At the point that you signalize it, a signalized rotary, it's much more efficient, and the pedestrian walking distances are much shorter with a normal signalized intersection. So what we're doing in another town is we're actually taking out a rotary so that we can create short pedestrian sequences with some islands so people can safely move across. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it, but you should be aware that there's this trade-off. They're good for cars, bad for pedestrians, which is why in Europe, which is often shown as the examples, you'll find them just outside the downtowns, but they don't put them in the downtowns. They put them outside. away from where the pedestrian crossings are for the most part. They try to do that. So, but all of those options would be available to you and continue to be explored. Yes, sir.
You didn't mention that the residential tower was not in one of your recommendations. Can you tell me the feeling behind that? I would think a residential tower would be a highlight because you'd have the view of the Connecticut River.
Well, in theory, from an architectural design standpoint, if the community found that it was desirable to have a taller building, that could be something to consider. The fact of the matter is they're expensive to build on a per square foot basis, and when we looked at the marketplace, the advantage of somewhat lower scale buildings and more in the scale of what some of your larger buildings are, they're just a lot more affordable to build, and the amount that you would need to get up to get that view would be so significant that it's a dollar and cent thing more than anything else.
You wouldn't get it back in your sale.
Right. Yeah, so you get into mid-rise and high-rise codes, the structure's a lot greater, so a more moderate in what we think of as more town scale just seems to make the most sense, but for other reasons as well. But we would not expect a proposal necessarily to come up. Of course, anything can happen. We're trying to predict without being, as these gentlemen are, in the business of trying to actually match up the market, the costs, the fees, the different scales. But we're just looking into that and came up with that conclusion again. So the question had to do with the scale of buildings and towers, and we're saying that we just don't think it's likely from a financial standpoint, regardless of whether you would like one or not. Yes?
In terms of those three concept drawings,
Mm-hmm.
you have one in particular that stands out to you here?
Well, what we found is that alternatives that are similar to either B or C, which had quite a bit of positive response from the community, that developments that would head in that direction seem to be both feasible and most desirable. So without picking one, what we're saying is that family of site plans is what could reasonably emerge.
But basically, the biggest difference.
Well, it's whether you have lots of little small scale buildings or whether you have a few larger buildings is really the big difference.
You have a town green and Burke.
Yeah, and the historic buildings are preserved. It's just the mix of the uses, and that's going to be as much as anything a function of what the market can support. But I think one of the things that we did hear pretty clearly is that large expanses of asphalt, kind of traditional parking lots, are less attractive than if they can be broken up with some landscaping and not be such a big part, a dominant part of the site. One of the things that is hard to show in those drawings, though, is that it really is a sloped site and will be terraced, and what you'll see from the street will be different from what you'll see within the development. It's one of the benefits of it, actually. Sir, yes?
Do you have any idea what the mix of, whether residential units be rental or condo or mix?
I think the question is whether that would be rental or condo or mix. Based on the market and where it's been up till now, rental properties make more sense. Condominiums have been a lot more difficult to finance and to sell than rental properties. We're in an era of rental properties. But again, the conditions can change, all kinds of different circumstances could occur. But peering from our perspective, looking at the marketplace, that seemed to be most likely. Any other questions or comments? We can have it with lemonade and cookies. There's one more. There is one more. Yes, ma'am.
For 200 residential units, how many cars would you expect from that?
Well, the question is, for 200 units, how many cars would you expect to have? Traditionally, developments have gone up to about 2 spaces per unit because there may be 2 people driving it. Most of the projects that we are doing now in these kinds of environments are about 1.5 spaces per unit. One of the benefits, though, of this site is that it is sloped, and it's not at all unlikely that what will occur, I can't guarantee it, but working with developers of similar sites, there's a chance to tuck the parking down on below at the basement level, so to speak, because you have a basement side that you can access from one side, so that it doesn't have to be all out on the site, which when you have a snowy winter, this winter I was thinking about the fact that, boy, having a space inside would have been really a nice thing. So that's another another aspect of it. So a mix of the parking below in a kind of a terraced way is a way to diminish the impact. But that will be up to what the market is looking for. Yeah, another question.
Is there potential for transit access for Milton area transit?
Well, there's certainly an opportunity for bus service in this kind of location, either now or in the future as you revise it. But the amount of transit, you're really, unfortunately, in some ways, you're pretty heavy automobile-oriented community, both because of what happens in the off hours. But I will say that one of the things that we're seeing a lot of course, Boston is unusual, but the greater region is there's a tremendous amount of bicycling going on and walking. So people in my office, we have several people who bicycle 5 miles to work, and some just a mile or two. And I can imagine that scooting across, I don't know how safe that bridge is right now for bicycling, but there are other ways that people can get around.
There are paths on the side of the bridge.
Yeah, so we certainly see, we've seen year-round a tremendous increase in people who could say, I can bicycle, I can go to a restaurant, I can go to, my job. You see those kinds of connections build up. Okay, well, thank you very much. Great.
And again, thank you, everyone, particularly those who helped in terms of putting this project together. And I appreciate all your work, Steve, and that of Josh, who wasn't able to be here tonight. And certainly this is the beginning of lots of more dialogue and work that needs to occur. And invite you to have some more conversation with us outside, as well as at our various meetings that will be occurring over the next several weeks and months. It is a project that we're hoping to get up and moving soon. I know the developer, Dan, is here tonight. He's very interested in moving this along, and I think members of our community are very interested in it as well. And I just want to make one comment about some of the transportation questions, which are very important. I know what you're talking about in terms of the traffic volumes and the various times of the day, and actually various times of the year. And you'll recall when we had the work done on the bridge, that was just a couple of years ago, there was a real concern as to how traffic would flow, and we were able to monitor the traffic and come up with a plan that worked. In terms of this project, it's going to have to be obviously a more permanent solution. And I trust there are transportation folks and engineers that are very knowledgeable and will help us with this. I don't see any reason why Portland can't develop our properties just like every other community does, but of course the eye toward safety and in terms of the historic integrity of our community is something that's very important to us. And we look forward to this process with our owner-developer and all of our community and the boards and commissions. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I think they're excellent questions. So. Okay, yeah, I will. And the report that Steve talked about is online, and it will be available for you to look at in more detail. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more conversation and information that you'll need to give to us. So, thank you very much.